order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. As a reminder, members participating in a hearing remotely should be visible on their camera throughout the hearing. As with in-person meetings, members are responsible for controlling their own microphones. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. And as a reminder, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository to sccc.repository@mail.house.gov. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform the committee staff immediately. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this remote hearing of the House of Representatives Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Today, we're going to hear about how the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Build Back Better Act will attract new investments to help the United States decarbonize important sectors, expand domestic supply chains, manufacture climate solutions, and create good paying jobs. So now I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. And thanks again for joining us today. Tackling the climate crisis presents us with incredible challenges and opportunities. The challenges are clear. We must reduce pollution and reach net zero as quickly as possible. We must lead other nations in the transition to renewables and electric vehicles. And we must make life-saving investments in resilience, in public health, and in environmental justice. Meeting these challenges with clean energy provides us with historic opportunities to create millions of good-paying jobs, to drive down the cost of energy, and to drive down the cost of climate-fueled disasters. It also gives us an opportunity to shore up supply chains and to clean up hard-to-decarbonize industries. In doing all this, we intend for the United States of America to lead the 21st century global economy. But we must be clear-eyed and responsive to how the changeover to clean energy will affect American families and our economy. And as the clean energy economy grows, we will still have to grapple with the constraints posed by our longtime dependency on fossil fuels. But America has met challenges like these before, and I'm confident that we will do so again. We know what we need to do. In our Climate Crisis Action Plan, we recommend using incentives to retool and expand domestic manufacturing of clean energy, electric vehicles, and EV components. We supported investing in a national network of zero-emission fueling infrastructure. And we called for strong policies to strengthen manufacturing in America. The all-important Made in the USA tag, with an eye on creating good jobs, especially in areas of the country that have struggled to attract economic investment. And we've made significant progress on these fronts. As American automakers move to all electric vehicles in the coming years, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law provides for the deployment of 500,000 chargers across America. And this historic investment in infrastructure also boosts jobs through modernizing the electric grid and the battery processing industry. But to truly chart the course forward, we must get the cost-saving, climate-focused Build Back Better Act and the important domestic manufacturing-focused American Competes Act to the president's desk. We are in a hyper-competitive race with China and other countries to build these industries, to attract capital and to create jobs. Automakers like Ford, GM, and Tesla are moving fast on EVs. Just last week, GM announced a plan to build a battery plant in Michigan and to retool a factory outside Detroit that will produce electric pickup trucks. This follows announcements by Ford about EV and battery production expansion in Tennessee and Kentucky, and from Tesla in Texas. So with the right policies and incentives, we will win the EV race against China and the European Union. We can't afford to lose it. Just last year, global investment in climate solutions reached $755 billion. The global market for solar energy is expected to be worth more than $220 billion by 2026. And according to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, we can create an estimated 2,000 jobs for every additional gigawatt of domestic solar manufacturing capacity that we build. And with wind energy projects like the ones off the coast of New York and New Jersey, we can produce energy right here in America with technologies that are built by union labor in America with materials that are made in America. This is how we lower costs for families over time and win the 21st century. Congress has got to make smart investments today to continue to lead the global economy tomorrow. And the bipartisan infrastructure law laid that foundation. We must now build on it with the clean energy investments in the Build Back Better Act and with the forward-looking policy in the America Competes Act. Today, we'll hear from industry leaders and experts on how these investments will attract companies to the U.S., create high-quality jobs, and grow opportunities for everyone. With that, I recognize our ranking member, Mr. Graves, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all of the witnesses for joining us today. Good to see some of y'all again, and some of y'all for the first time. This hearing is important, and the chair opened up by talking about moving in a direction that ensures American leadership. And I think it's important to note that the United States actually achieved a pretty amazing leadership role in that we became entirely dependent on ourselves for energy. We became energy secure, we became energy independent. And some more recent policies on energy and climate have begun to cause an erosion in that energy security and that energy independence. For example, we've become more dependent upon Russia for our energy needs. In over the last several months, we've seen energy prices increasing, which of course disproportionately affects those who can least afford it. As a matter of fact, we've seen energy prices, whether it's gasoline or projected prices to heat and cool our homes, increase anywhere from 25 to 54%. And again, that's everything from gasoline to fuel our cars to the utility costs to heat our homes this winter. In fact, 1 in every 5 Americans have said that they're unable to fully pay their electricity bills. This is a significant change from what we've seen historically, where we had rather stable and rather affordable access to energy. We've unfortunately seen other confusing policies where the administration has come in and shut down projects like the Twin Metals mine in Minnesota, whenever this is an opportunity for the United States to do what I believe every member of this committee has talked about, both Republican and Democrat, and that is to source our own strategic and rare earths in order to meet the needs of renewable energy and energy storage demands. And so really confusing. We've seen advocacy to stop lease sales whenever this administration has released reports that maybe one of our witnesses was even involved in putting together, that shows that energy production in the offshore is actually the cleanest energy that there is in terms of measured by emissions, in terms of lowest emissions. Some of the lowest emitting sources of conventional fuels, yet taking efforts or actions to actually shut that down. Moving in a direction where not only we're going to become more dependent upon energy sources that have a higher environmental footprint, but also have much lower labor standards. And Madam Chair, I just think it's critical as we move forward, we take all of these things into consideration. What are we going to do with the e-waste? Where are the raw materials going to come from? Looking at the mining practices, looking at slave and child labor issues. And in reality, Madam Chair, what we've seen is we've actually seen greater achievements in terms of affordability of energy, in terms of energy security, in terms of emissions reduction, in terms of not becoming dependent upon other countries. And that's by policies that we saw historically in the United States. So those actually were more successful at achieving the objectives that I laid out: affordability, lower emissions, higher energy security, less dependence upon foreign nations, particularly those nations that are less friendly to the United States. And so I really look forward to continuing to work on a bipartisan basis to truly follow the science, not the emotion, but to follow the science and to pursue policies that result in achieving those objectives that make sense for the American citizens, not the policies that make sense for citizens of other countries that in many cases may not be friendly to the United States. I remind you, Madam Chair, the Biden administration released a report showing that we're going to have a 31 to 58% increase, for example, in natural gas demand globally. And at the same time, if this administration and if members of Congress are carrying out policies to stop the domestic production of natural gas, all that does is, one, it seeds a huge economic sector to Vladimir Putin. We know right now what he is doing with those resources that he gains from these inadvisable policies. And number two, it's going to result in dirtier fuel sources, because as we've stated many times in this committee, the United States, our natural gas, for example, exported to Europe has a 41% lower profile of emissions, and exported to Asia has a 47% lower emissions profile. So I just think it's really important that we incorporate more science into these decisions and stop blindly heading down this path that is undermining America's interest and playing into the hands of other countries. So look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And without objection, members who wish to enter opening statements into the record have 5 days to do so. Now I want to welcome our witnesses. I'm going to proceed with introductions, and then when we come to Mr. McConnell, Mr. Crenshaw, I'm going to ask you to introduce him. First, we have Paul Browning. He's the president and CEO of the North American division of Fortescue Future Industries. Mr. Browning leads FFI's efforts to expand hydrogen energy in North America with the goal of producing hydrogen from 100% renewable sources. He was previously the CEO of Mitsubishi Power Americas, leading a team that expanded hydrogen projects and started a battery energy storage business. Next, Ms. Abigail Ross Hopper is the president and CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association. At SEIA, Ms. Hopper leads a national effort to expand the reach of solar energy as a significant percentage of U.S. energy generation. She was previously the director of the Department of Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which oversees development and leasing for offshore energy. She was also the director of the Maryland Energy Administration. Mr. Crenshaw, I recognize you to introduce Mr. McConnell. Mr. Crenshaw, I'm not able to hear you.
All right, that should work now. Thank you, Chairwoman. I'm happy to introduce the Honorable Chuck McConnell, the Executive Director for Center for Carbon Management and Energy Sustainability at the University of Houston. We're glad to have a Houstonian here on the panel, and I know the committee is excited to hear your testimony. And I know the University of Houston has been leading the way in carbon utilization, recycling, and carbon emissions reduction rather than eradicating the fuel source itself. So we're glad to have you. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. We also have Jessica Ekdish. She's the Vice President of Legislation and Federal Affairs at the Blue Green Alliance. Ms. Ekdish directs BGA's federal legislative policy and partnerships on climate, energy, and infrastructure issues. Previously, she managed the Sierra Club's legislative and administrative advocacy, leading efforts to secure methane emission standards for the oil and gas sector, as well as federal clean air and water protections. So without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Mr. Browning, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your presentation. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chaircaster, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee. My name is Paul Browning. I'm President and CEO of Fortescue Future Industries North America, or FFI. I joined the company in January after a 30-year career leading multinational businesses that develop, manufacture, build, and finance large energy projects in the US and around the world. Thanks for this opportunity to testify before you today. FFI is a well-financed global green hydrogen company launched 18 months ago that's committed to producing zero carbon green hydrogen made from 100% renewable energy. The unique appeal of green hydrogen is its ability to store renewable energy and use it to power a broad set of needs, including transportation, electric generation and storage, industrial heat, steel making, and others. My testimony is going to focus on the following 3 points. 1, green hydrogen is happening right now. 2, green hydrogen will create and protect U.S. manufacturing jobs and improve U.S. competitiveness. And 3, fully capturing the U.S. green hydrogen opportunity is going to require the right policy environment. So my first point is that green hydrogen is happening right now, and I'm going to use as that evidence of some of the work we've been doing at FFI. Over the long term, FFI's vision is to make green hydrogen the most widely traded commodity in the world. Our first job at FFI is using green hydrogen to decarbonize our parent company, Fortescue Metals Group, the world's 4th largest iron ore producer. In 2022, we will begin to deploy green hydrogen technologies into our haul trucks, our locomotives, and our ships. Next, we will help decarbonize heavy industry around the world by annually shipping 15 million tons of green hydrogen by 2030, which is the equivalent of the annual gasoline consumption of Florida, New York, and Ohio combined. Today, we employ more than 700 people across 23 countries and have a portfolio of over 400 gigawatts of renewable energy projects in various stages of development. We're already investing in the US. Our recent activity in the US market includes an acquisition in Delaware, an aviation fuel offtake agreement in California, and a green ammonia offtake agreement with Covestro, a company with facilities in 11 US states. We're also evaluating project opportunities across the Western US and Texas, and we're hiring in Texas, Delaware, and Florida. My second point is that green hydrogen can grow manufacturing jobs and improve competitiveness. The world's demand for green products is increasing rapidly. Companies are demanding green steel, green aluminum, and green transportation services. Decarbonizing heavy industry with green hydrogen can protect US manufacturing jobs in a carbon-constrained world. Our green hydrogen projects will also create thousands of jobs, often in communities that formerly relied on coal mining or coal-fired power generation and already have the water rights, power infrastructure, and workforce on hand for green hydrogen production. And my third point is that fully capturing the US green hydrogen opportunity requires the right policy environment. Today in the United States, green hydrogen and green ammonia projects are not eligible for tax credits, while fossil fuel-based blue hydrogen and ammonia projects require or receive 45Q carbon capture credits. Current law is picking a winner by incentivizing fossil fuel hydrogen and not incentivizing green hydrogen. Across the globe, governments are dedicating capital to building their own green hydrogen industries, and we want to ensure US remains competitive in this space globally. Like energy transition technologies that preceded green hydrogen, the key imperative is to reduce the cost of green hydrogen. We have a proven recipe in the US for achieving cost reduction in energy transition technologies like wind, solar, and lithium-ion batteries. The recipe is invest in R&D and drive massive scaling of the industry with federal PTC and ITC legislation and state-level policies. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law provides the R&D support, and states and regulated utilities are providing policy support through net zero carbon commitments. All that remains for you to do is to enact the federal ITC and PTC for hydrogen that are contained in the Build Back Better bill. In closing, the conditions are ripe for expansive growth in US green hydrogen. With a laser focus on green hydrogen development, the US can use its abundance of renewable energy to continue its energy leadership during the energy transition. This will create jobs, economic growth, and export markets for American-made renewable energy. Thank you for the opportunity to present my testimony today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Browning. Next, Ms. Hopper, you're recognized for 5 minutes to provide a summary of your testimony.
Great, thank you and good afternoon. Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, thank you so much for having me here today and inviting me to testify before the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. The Solar Energy Industries Association, or SEIA, is the voice of the nation's competitive solar and storage industry. We represent 1,000 private sector companies led by entrepreneurs, risk takers, and business leaders. Our companies know what it's like to have to make payroll, and they know the challenges of running a business. While our industry certainly has grown rapidly in recent years, solar is still a relatively small part of the energy mix. We represent less than 4% of the nation's energy use. Still, even with that small percentage, that reduces carbon emissions by 127 million metric tons per year, while creating American jobs and careers and growing the US economy. So the good news is that lowering carbon emissions is not the only reason to accelerate solar deployment. As the solar and storage industry grows, we will need to hire 800,000 new American workers to reach a total workforce of more than 1 million strong. Along the way, the industry is poised to invest more than $820 billion into the US economy. So we're here today to talk about the importance of US manufacturing. And SEIA has a manufacturing division that represents manufacturers throughout the solar supply chain. We therefore have a fairly unique insight into the opportunities and the challenges of growing the US solar manufacturing base. Starting about 3 years ago, we began to strategically engage with our manufacturers across the industry to understand the elements necessary to further build US domestic manufacturing capacity. One of the things we found is that the industry has changed a great deal over the last few years. There is now massive interest in a comprehensive build out of domestic solar manufacturing. And that interest is driven both from the manufacturing side and the developer side. But we have to recognize the importance of our existing manufacturing base. We currently have over 30,000 people in the solar manufacturing workforce in the United States. They're employed in places like steel plants in South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. It includes trackers and racking manufacturers in Arizona, Ohio, New Mexico, and California. And it includes manufacturers of solar panels and inverters in Georgia, Washington State, Florida, Ohio, Texas, Illinois, Wisconsin, and beyond. And it doesn't stop there. We also have inputs. We also supply inputs and raw materials to solar products here in the United States. That means quartz mining, metallurgical grade silicon, and polysilicon production in places like Alabama, Mississippi, Michigan, Tennessee, and Washington State. In short, the United States has the natural resources and the private sector know-how to lead in clean energy manufacturing with the right policies in place. Just to put a little bit of color on that, a medium-sized utility scale project utilizes 12,000 tons of steel, and our industry will require 2.5 million tons of steel by 2030. That is American steel going to build American energy. And that steel is going to come from factories in West Virginia and elsewhere in the United States. And so based on conversations we're having with manufacturers and what they're telling us about the likely impact of the proposed policies, the United States will produce in short order an additional 15 to 20 gigawatts of domestic solar panel manufacturing. We are literally on the precipice of a manufacturing renaissance. And it's not just panels and steel. US polysilicon plants are also ready to roar ahead as their customers build factories here in the United States. The polysilicon industry has been treated very unfairly by China, put on its back foot since China put steep tariffs on US polysilicon and made it impossible to sell into that market. Some US facilities are either producing minimally or literally mothballed, but idle capacity is ready to ramp up if we put the right policies into place. So in sum, we have real potential for a complete solar supply chain here in the United States, manufacturing and building for the solar industry. Now is the time to invest in American manufacturing. We have the technology, we have the know-how, and we certainly have the resources to make it happen. So thank you very much for asking me to be here. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Hopper. Next is Mr. McConnell. Welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes. And don't forget to
There's always one guy, isn't there? So thank you, Madam Chair, and the committee members for the opportunity to testify on manufacturing a clean energy future, and specifically solutions that are made in America. It's particularly gratifying that the technology and commercial advancements in carbon management that were in the early stages at DOE some 10 years ago when I served as the Assistant Secretary have evolved into solutions that can be deployed at commercial scale. Such advancements are proof positive that such investments in technologies do pay dividends for the American people. It's also gratifying to see that this committee is invested in carbon emissions solutions and not the elimination of fossil fuels. Carbon management is what will create real solutions. Carbon management is in full development with companies in oil and gas, petrochemicals, electric power, cement, steel, and other manufacturing entities. They're not only pledging to be net zero carbon by 2050, but are investing in real emissions reduction technologies. This is the essence of our management efforts at the University of Houston that I'm privileged to lead through our Center for Carbon Management and Energy. Our external University Energy Advisory Board has supported the launch of our center and continues to invest in public-private partnerships with the university, such as the Texas Carbon Neutral Coalition. Our CCME is designed to advance all the critical elements of transformative commercial solutions through multidisciplinary collaborations in engineering, science, business policy, and law, all of which are required for real solutions that are at scale in terms of emissions reduction and continue to provide reliable, affordable, and resilient energy supplies of fuels, chemicals, electricity, and manufactured products. Let me identify 3 examples of project investments that will realize these real solutions. First is carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS. I'm certain you're all aware of the $100 billion project conceptualization that the 14 significant CO2 emitters in the Gulf Coast have come together to promote. It's not one big project, but it's an alignment of the industry players to work together collectively, along with our university and community, to realize the vision. Most of these industries are also members of the CCS consortia. That is made up of 40+ member organizations from not only industry, but multiple academic institutions, NGOs, and legal firms. Were launched last year through the support of DOE's Office of Fossil as part of the Southern States Energy Board's programmatic support aimed at the broad commercial deployment of CCUS. This designation from our UHCCME is not simply to be a regional center, but to support national work in CCUS. Our consortia has developed a roadmap that's summarized in the written testimony submitted, and it recognized 3 critical enablers for CCUS commercialization. 1 is financial and investment incentives. 2 is policy and regulatory support. And 3, people and stakeholder engagement. CCUS is not a perpetuation of the fossil fuel industry. It's a fundamental enabler for the energy transition. Second, it's hydrogen and the development of massive increases in hydrogen production that must be decarbonized to deliver the clean fuel of the future. Our university is working with Shell and the Wood Group in a DOE project to decarbonize a major steam methane reformer through advanced carbon capture technology. You know, natural gas generated hydrogen is nearly 90% of the current world production, and volumes are anticipated to grow by 5 to 10x in the coming 50 years. And thirdly, there is a need for 24/7 decarbonized electricity. This type of baseload electricity must fuel the energy transition electrification needs and utilize the abundant, secure, and low-cost fossil fuels in our country. The world's first zero emissions alum cycle power plant will be built in Illinois at the ADM site by 8 Rivers and Warwick Carbon Solutions. The ADM carbon sequestration geologic source site was developed with DOE, as was the net power process technology. Natural gas-based power with CCUS has been endorsed by this administration as a requirement for this clean energy future. Let me emphasize, it's critical that we not confuse the mission to be the elimination of the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry supplies over 80% of the world's energy. And frankly, we cannot grow by subtraction. We must utilize all energy fuels and technologies. And is the mission. Reliable, affordable, resilient energy and carbon emissions reduction and the elimination of greenhouse gases that impact the climate. And not just in our country, but for the global marketplace that looks to the US for such leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell. Next, Ms. Ekdish, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jessica Ekdish, and I am the Vice President of Legislation and Federal Affairs at the Blue-Green Alliance, which brings together labor unions and environmental organizations to build a clean, prosperous, and equitable economy. We are at a unique and critical moment to be discussing the role of manufacturing in achieving a clean economy. We know that climate change is a dire and urgent threat, and the longer we delay, the stronger the action required. We also know that the industrial sector is responsible for a significant portion of these emissions. At the same time, manufacturing has an outsized impact on our economy, contributing significantly to our GDP, supplying good-paying jobs to workers across the country, and essentially serving as the backbone of the American middle class. While manufacturing directly employs about 1 in 11 American workers today, we've lost nearly 5 million manufacturing jobs since 1997. Decades of bad policy, offshoring, and outsourcing have weakened our supply chains and cost jobs. The COVID crisis has not only underscored the central importance of manufacturing to our economy and our security, but has also revealed profound weaknesses in our critical supply chains. These interconnected challenges are an opportunity. Worldwide, our competitors are rushing to capture the manufacturing and jobs gains in the rapidly emerging clean economy. The decisions we make now will determine whether the next generation of investments are made here in the US and whether those investments will result in the kind of good-paying jobs that are often out of reach for too many Americans. We have an opportunity to transform our industrial base and rebuild American manufacturing to lead in the clean economy, to meet our climate goals, support good union jobs, and power a real and lasting economic recovery that extends to all. The recently enacted bipartisan infrastructure law takes important steps in this direction, which I outline further in my written testimony. But critical gaps remain, which are filled in the House-passed Build Back Better Act. To take electric vehicles as an example, the bipartisan bill makes important investments to build out a nationwide public EV charging network, establish a domestic supply chain for batteries, and expand the Advanced Technologies Vehicle Manufacturing Loan Program, the ATVM, to include a broader range of vehicles. However, these investments alone will not ensure that the shift to EVs happens at the pace and scale needed to address climate change, and that it strengthens domestic manufacturing and supply chains, secures and grows good jobs, and helps reverse decades-long declines in job quality and access to middle-class careers. Additional policies and investments are needed. First, deployment incentives are needed to ensure faster, broader, and fairer adoption of domestically manufactured electric vehicles. The Build Back Better Act updates the EV tax credit to accelerate and facilitate purchase of EVs by lowering barriers to access the credit and to incentivize domestic assembly, domestic content, and purchase of vehicles made by union workers. Second, we have to invest to make the US a leading manufacturer of EVs and the technology that goes into them. Congress should first expand, retool, and convert US automotive and component manufacturing through new and existing tax grant and loan programs. Second, onshore critical supply chains like batteries, cells, and the materials that go into them. Third, modernize and cut emissions from our energy-intensive industrial base. And finally, ensure that these investments translate into good jobs and are targeted to revitalize deindustrialized communities and build new pathways into family supporting careers. The Build Back Better Act includes all of these key investments. Without this action, we risk ceding future industries to global competitors. Across the economy, we are already fighting against decades of short-sighted policy and investment decisions that have spurred offshoring and outsourcing, cost manufacturing jobs and family supporting careers, and driven down living and working standards. The US is lagging far behind our competitors in investments to capture clean technology manufacturing jobs and to ensure that, for example, the good advanced engine and transmission jobs of today become the good EV propulsion jobs of tomorrow. Whether or not workers across America see the gains from the coming clean economy depends on what Congress does now. The US can once again lead the world in manufacturing the technologies and products of the future, but we need a proactive strategy and a significant national investment to do so. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank all of the witnesses for your insightful and informative testimony. Now we'll go to member questions. First up, I'm going to recognize Congresswoman Bonamici for the first 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Thank you so much, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, but thank you especially to our witnesses for bringing your expertise here today. Ms. Ektish, thank you for your mention of all the work that you're doing with the Blue-Green Alliance. And in fact, the bill we're debating today, the Competes Act, is relevant too in terms of incentivizing and growing U.S. manufacturing. So I appreciate that. Ms. Hopper, you referenced in your testimony the increased interest in expanding domestic solar manufacturing. And that's true in the Pacific Northwest, in my home state of Oregon, but also across the country. We have the capability, we have the opportunity to onshore the solar supply chain and create good paying jobs here at home. So what are the most important policies that are in Build Back Better, for example, that will increase the manufacturing here, invigorate the supply chain, the domestic supply chain, and what kinds of job growth will we see if the climate investments in the Build Back Better Act are enacted?
Thank you so much for that question. There absolutely is a great interest in onshoring a lot of the manufacturing processes. But the critical sort of asterisk is if the right policies are in place. So the right policies are sort of trifold. One is, let me start by saying companies want certainty. It doesn't matter what kind of company it is, what kind of business they're in, if they're big or small, companies deploy capital when they have certainty about the market. And so everything I'm going to talk about is about providing certainty. In terms of providing demand certainty, the long-term extensions of the investment tax credit and the production tax credit provide a market certainty that there will be a continued and accelerated demand for the product. Investment tax credit for manufacturing investment provides a certainty, right? And then a production tax credit for manufacturing sort of gives companies that runway to say, okay, there's going to be a stable policy environment so I can make the determination to build factories worth literally hundreds of millions of dollars, right, in your state or another member state. And so on the manufacturing side, and sort of that suite of policies is really critical. They're all obviously contained in the Build Back Better agenda, but those are critical to providing the business environment so that companies will deploy capital. Then if we think about sort of the job creation and the economic impact that could have, looking solely at the manufacturing sector, just going to look at my notes so I got the number right. So we think by 2025, there'll be about 27,000 additional direct manufacturing jobs. We have about 30,000 now, so almost a doubling in a couple of years.
Impressive.
And that's, it's pretty amazing. And then by 2030, about 40,000 additional direct manufacturing jobs. Then if we look, but that's obviously a sector of our ecosystem here, just in the solar and solar plus storage world. We think to get to the goals that the president has set, there'll be about 800,000 more Americans employed in the solar and solar plus storage industry. There's about 230,000 now, about 800,000 more in the next 8 years. So as you can see, we can talk a lot about manufacturing and climate and all sorts of things, but this really is a story of innovation, job creation, and economic opportunity.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yesterday, I introduced my Regional Clean Energy Innovation Act that will create a DOE office responsible for identifying, overseeing, and funding regional energy innovation institutes. And they'll help clean energy technologies achieve commercialization by leveraging regional market capabilities, industry expertise, and federal resources. So, Mr. Browning, if we are to achieve some widespread green hydrogen commercialization, how will that affect different regions of the country, and which parts of the U.S. will benefit most from associated investment and job creation?
Thanks for the question. Our first focus area in the United States is in the Western states, including your own. The reason for that is the Western states have a lot of supportive policy in place. Their power grids are also already heavily penetrated by renewable power. And that creates the right kind of environment for green hydrogen, which, again, green hydrogen is a store of renewable power. And so having a power grid that already has a lot of renewable power on it gives us the renewable power we need in order to create green hydrogen. As we put more and more renewable power on the grid, we're going to find that it's extreme weather events like the heat wave that the West had 2 summers ago that caused big power disruptions. The power grid is going to need to be able to store renewable energy in times when it's in abundance, so that it can be available in extreme weather events or other periods of time when we're short on power. And that role that green hydrogen is going to play in the power industry is also then going to create the scale that we need in order to make green power available for transportation uses.
Thank you. Mr.
industrial
Browning, I'm
uses,
sorry,
and
but
others.
my time has long expired. I'm going to have to yield
Okay.
back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Good. I'm sure we'll have additional time to get into it a little more. Next up, Mr. Crenshaw, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to start with my friend, Mr. McConnell, with a very general question, which is, if a lot of the radical environmentalists got what they wanted right now, and we stopped producing any oil and gas in the United States, what do you think that would do to global carbon emissions, which is indeed our ultimate goal, to reduce global carbon emissions?
Well, it would certainly have an impact, but that's not a scenario that I don't believe anybody could envision or expect. The growth in the world's demand for energy continues to expand. We're going to grow by 50% over the next 50 years. And so oil and gas is projected to continue to be, along with coal and other fossil fuels, at least 70% of the world's energy mix. So the real issue about emissions reduction is to eliminate the emissions.
Right. And somebody's going to produce it. Somebody's going to fulfill that demand.
Sure.
I mean, who has cleaner production standards, the US or OPEC?
Well, I think we all know that we lead the world in that regard. And so from an energy security standpoint, but really from an environmental standpoint, making it in America is really the choice.
And my next question, I'll move on to you, Ms. Hopper. Were you at the Department of Interior when they came out with a study that showed, this is from the Obama administration, that global emissions would increase without the current slate of Gulf of Mexico lease sales?
You'd have to tell, I was there for 2 years, so I'm not sure when that study
It was in
came out.
November of 2016, it was published at BOEM.
Yes, I imagine, I think I was, yes.
So
2015
it was
and 2016.
public. I mean, so do you agree with that, the finding of that study?
I have to admit, I don't recall the finding of that study, but I do have
Yeah.
lots of trust in the scientists at BOEM.
Yeah, it's an interesting study, and we could potentially submit it for the record. I want to ask you about solar panels, because one of the concerns I have is that we don't properly address trade-offs. That we don't look at the direct environmental impacts of solar and wind generation, and only look at the potential climate impacts down the road. And I often wonder if that's a mistake. I'm not against solar and wind by any stretch of the imagination, but I do wonder if we over subsidize it. And so, one simple question would be this: I mean, how many solar panels would it take to make up the generation necessary to meet the Biden administration's goals? Do we have a ballpark estimate of that?
I don't have a ballpark estimate of the number of solar panels. I think
Or area?
So this is one number I do have. So at NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab, issued a study. It's cited in the Department of Energy's future study that they issued in October of 2021 that says, in light of the president's goal, if 40% of the US energy generation came from solar, they were looking at land mass, it would take about 0.5% of the US land mass.
Okay. Well, Princeton University estimated that in order to meet the goal of emission-free grid by 2025, so that's the goal I'm talking about, just to be clear, it would require expanding wind and solar by 10% annually until 2030. And you need a chunk of land the size of South Dakota. So it's not small by any stretch. And then I want to move on to the claim that solar panels are actually net zero emissions. Is that really true? Because there's a life cycle to solar panels, whether it's the mining of the material, the manufacturing of the panel, transportation from China, not to mention land use issues. It's 300 to 400 times more land required for the same amount of energy than natural gas or nuclear plants. So, how do we factor these costs in a little bit better?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you raised that question, because I think it's a question that a lot of people have. Like, most of us are, want to make sure that this is ultimately a benefit to the environment. On the land, I'll answer your second question. But on the land mass question, I think one of the most innovative parts of the solar industry is these like multi-use land opportunities. So we can have a long conversation about sort of the ways in which farmers and solar in particular coexist on land, and the way that ag land, it's not necessarily being taken out of production, but it's an additive to a family farm. Your question about life cycle, though, is a critical one, and also one that the National Renewable Energy Labs has done studies on. I have it here in my lap, but it recently did a study on the life cycle emissions of solar panels as compared to other technology sources. And even with some of the things that you've mentioned, sort of how the mining and the production and the transport, it's still significantly less life cycle cost than other sources of energy, in particular coal. But I think your point, though, is that I think I hopeful we would agree on this, is that building things overseas is not ideal, right? Like manufacturing.
That's certainly true. That's certainly true. And unfortunately, I'm out of time and I have to yield back. But if I had more time, I'd ask you about the permitting processes that are the big obstructions to building more solar farms and wind power in the United States. Maybe another member can ask that question. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Okay. Next up, Rep. Caston, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much to our speakers. I'm going to take a little bit of a different perspective than my friend, Mr. Crenshaw. I come from Chicago, home of Daniel Burnham, who famously said after the Chicago fire, "Make no small plans." And some people might be intimidated by the ambition of the change we have to make, but I choose to embrace it. I think that's what's made America great. And yeah, we're going to have to build a lot of stuff, and that is awesome. Let's do it. My goodness, let's do it for the environment. Let's do it for the economy. But by the way, the markets are going to do it if we don't. And as you look around the various states in this country, 15 years ago, you could divide the states and saying there were coal states, there were gas states, and there were renewable states, which was basically hydro. Illinois was one of those coal states. Illinois has made this remarkable transition over the last 15 years. We went from having 24 plants. By the end of this year, we're going to have maybe 5 coal plants, and the ones that are there are basically not running because they aren't economic, because they produce an unviable product that has to compete against all this wind we're building, all the solar we're building that is so much cheaper, because markets are doing what markets are doing. They are providing people with what they want. People do not want fossil fuel. People don't even want solar energy. They want to know that when they turn their machines on, the power's there, that when they turn their lights on, that the power's there, that when they turn their shower on, the water is hot, and they want it as cheaply as possible. And so we're seeing these states like Illinois make the transition, where we are getting more and more from less and less input, and that is awesome. It grows our competitiveness. It's having this wonderful advantage that we're attracting companies to Illinois like Rivian. I went and drove one of their pickups yesterday, sitting there in Bloomington, Normal, 3,000 employees, making something that, by the way, is cheaper to run right in the heart of coal country. And if you look then at those states that have not made the transition, they're all at the bottom of all the league tables. Lowest GDP per capita in the country, West Virginia, Alabama, Kentucky. Highest GDP per capita, Massachusetts, California, New York. The difference between those states is states that have built their economies around resource extraction and states that have built their economies around resource conversion. That is something to embrace, but I raised that to put the question to you, Ms. Ekdish, because I think you were right at the nexus of this. If we make this transition that is in our economic interest, that markets want to make, that markets are making, it will represent the biggest wealth transfer in the history of our species, from energy producers to energy consumers. That scares the bejesus out of energy producers, and it scares the bejesus out of the employees in those industries, because historically they have been left behind. So Ms. Ekdish, as we make this transition, what do we need to do to make sure that the success that is coming in Illinois doesn't come at the expense of the good people of West Virginia? How do we make sure that we look out for people equally in this transition?
Thank you for the question, Congressman, and certainly share your enthusiasm about the opportunity ahead of us. This, I think, as you said, this transition is coming, but Whether or not we capture the benefits of that transition here and whether or not our workers see the benefits of this transition is, I think, the task before us. We know that our competitors are racing to make these investments. We need to capture those here. And I think we have a number of different ways that we can do that and ensure that our workforce benefits, including ensuring that as we're making investments to increase demand for these materials, that we're attaching domestic content standards to ensure that we are increasing demand for domestic manufactured goods. But we also need to invest directly in building out these factories, building out assembly here in the US. And there's a number of different provisions in the Build Back Better Act, including the ATVM loan program, including a number of the manufacturing investment tax credits that Abigail mentioned, 48C, for example, and production tax credits that will help us build out those facilities here. And to your question about West Virginia, I would say we really do need to think about where we're making these investments and driving these investments towards the workers in the communities that need them the most. And that includes labor standards, workforce standards, but also incentives or set-asides that will drive these investments to places that have seen closures. There's an additional program in the Build Back Better Act focused on conversion and retooling grants that will target investments to recently closed or at-risk facilities, so we can really harness the existing assets that we have and make sure that the workers in those facilities are part of this transition and see themselves in this transition.
Well, thank you so much. I'm out of time, but I think it is the challenge of our time, and markets are going to make these transitions. Our job as regulators is to make sure that we do them in a way that looks out for those equities. So thank you for your leadership on this, and I yield back.
Thank you. Next, Representative Gonzalez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. First, I want to, I guess, give some advice to my Democratic colleagues. I'm hearing a lot of references to Build Back Better, as if that's the answer to our problems. Build Back Better, as far as I know, is dead. So if we're waiting for Build Back Better, I don't know how long it's going to take, but it's going to take a heck of a long time. So I think what we should really do, if we're going to be serious about this, is do what I always advocate for, which is to find bipartisan ways to make really smart policy choices to help move our economy and move our country forward, and in turn, solve some of the many challenges that we have. Secondly, was mentioned GDP per capita as in a correlation drawn between highest GDP per capita and those who have transitioned. Not on that list was Alaska, not on that list was North Dakota, which obviously have not transitioned in the same way, certainly North Dakota. Secondly, California, I used to live there and it's beautiful, and I like it in many ways, but it's the least affordable place in the country for a whole host of reasons, and it's the most unequal place in the country, economically. So not something that I think we want to suggest is a model for the entire world. That being said, let's continue the discussion and hopefully, again, get towards some bipartisan solutions. One that I hope that we can get to is this idea of clean steel technologies. Last year, I introduced a clean steel technology bill. Hopefully that it will be part of some bigger packages here coming soon. But Mr. Browning, I want to start with you because I think steel in particular is one of the hardest to decarbonize, but obviously essential. I know the steel industry well, and would like to hear your thoughts on this. So from your perspective, how far along are green hydrogen technologies and processes, and when do you expect this type of steel production will be cost competitive?
Yep. Well, thanks for that question. There's two main sources of carbon emissions during steel making. The first is the beginning process when you turn iron ore into iron. And we use coal today, metallurgical coal, to reduce iron ore to iron. In the future, we can use hydrogen to do the same thing. And as a matter of fact, it provides an opportunity, if you're a miner like our parent company is, to make your product green iron instead of iron ore. And then instead of shipping iron ore around the planet, you can ship iron to steel makers. And it takes about 70% of this carbon emissions of steel making out. Our company's investing in that technology right now, and we expect to be able to provide that to our customers because we've set a target to decarbonize our own operations by 2030 and to decarbonize our scope 3 or our customer by 2040. So we're looking at deploying that technology in the next decade for green steelmaking. The other source of emissions is the natural gas that's used for heating furnaces and other things. And there you have a choice of either electricity or green hydrogen to take the place of natural gas. Both of those are well-known technologies that we could deploy quickly.
Great. And how would increased funding for R&D at the federal level help de-risk some of these investments and speed time to commercialization?
Yeah, like I said, just deploying green hydrogen gets after that second one. It's really the first one, the reducing of iron ore to iron using hydrogen. I think if the Department of Energy made that one of their target areas, that would be something that I think would be very helpful to decarbonizing steelmaking.
Thank you. I only have 45 seconds left, so I'll hold on questions, but again, just want to urge all of us to be realistic about what the legislative paths forward are. I mean, we can all wish for our favorite policy, but if the political realities are what they are and folks aren't on board, we need to find another path. It's too urgent. I think we all agree that this is too urgent to just hope and pray for somebody to change his or her mind as opposed to finding real bipartisan solutions. And with that, I'll yield back.
Yeah, thank you, Rep. Gonzalez, and I hear you. And hope springs eternal, but thankfully it's not just hope. I mean, we do have the foundation through the bipartisan infrastructure law where folks came together and made progress, and that's what this hearing's about, to try to find those solutions moving forward. So next we'll go to Rep. Escobar. Welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the ranking member, and thanks to our panelists. I want to just very quickly say to my colleague, Mr. Gonzalez, that I agree with him, and we've got to find bipartisan solutions. I think, as the chair said, hope springs eternal, and we've got to keep working toward the greater climate vision in the Build Back Better Act, but we've got to find some immediate, urgent pathways and make some headway because the climate emergency and the climate crisis is unrelenting, and we have no time to waste. To all of our panelists, I am really grateful for all of you sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. I represent an economically disadvantaged community in West Texas, El Paso, Texas. And I'm very interested, Ms. Hopper, in visiting with you and learning from you a little bit more on the storage front. I want to give you some quick context, and then I'm eager to hear your recommendations and get any counsel from you on this issue. So we have an electric utility that is about to invest significant amount of ratepayer dollars. Ultimately, they will be ratepayer dollars in a new facility, a new power generation plant run with natural gas. Lots of folks in my community, myself included, are very concerned about this massive investment, especially when many of us are eager to move as quickly as possible to solar. What I keep hearing from the utility is that their big challenge is that there's not enough storage technology available today. And so this has got to be kind of, sort of like a stepping stone, waiting for the day when there is more adequate storage for solar. I live in a community that is not just economically disadvantaged, but we have the incredible asset of the sun. West Texas, we have like 360 days of sunshine in my community. So for a lot of us, there's this frustration that we're not moving quickly enough, and that we will have abandoned assets like this multi-million-dollar new plant that, in a few years may be an abandoned asset. What can you tell us? Are there avenues in the bipartisan infrastructure law that we should be looking very closely at? Or are there avenues that we should create in order to better incentivize utilities in the situations that I just described for you, like in my community, where storage is the issue?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And given the weather here, I really wish I was in El Paso today. It's really cold. You're certainly, your community is not alone in both the desire to transition to a more sustainable energy mix and perhaps a frustration about the speed with which that transition is happening. I would say that the bipartisan infrastructure law does provide opportunities to further develop. There's a lot of R&D money in this storage piece. There's certainly money around supply chain and infrastructure for building out the storage piece. But fundamentally, I'm a little skeptical of the claim that there's not enough storage, right? We have seen that solar has grown exponentially. Storage has grown whatever more is exponentially, right? Whatever word comes after growing exponentially. It is an incredibly, and there are models in other states and other utilities that have looked at natural gas facilities and solar plus storage facilities, and their regulators and the companies have decided that the solar plus storage choice is a better deal for ratepayers, right? That's the most important point, right? It is more reliable, more affordable, and will not be a stranded asset. And so I am happy to talk offline with you about some other examples that we may be able to point to make that economic case. But I do think that sort of in probably the things that we could agree on a bipartisan basis moving forward in whatever vehicle it is around storage is that there is the investment tax credit for standalone storage that would likely be helpful to your utility as they think about deploying that asset. Issues around transmission and investment tax credits for transmission build out. My guess is that would be interesting to them as well. And so I do think that both of what has passed and what still remains to be agreed upon would both be helpful to El Paso.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And we will definitely follow up. I'd love to learn more about some best practice models that my community can look at. Madam Chair, I'm out of time. Thank you. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. Helpful information to sunny states everywhere. So thanks for that. Next, we'll go to Representative Carter. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of the witnesses for being here. Appreciate this very much. Ms. Hopper, I'll begin with you. I have the honor and privilege of representing Georgia. Not only are we the #1 forestry state in the nation, but we have made great strides in also in solar energy. In fact, we're in the top 10 now, I believe #7, and we're headed shortly to be #4. And I've been a strong proponent of this. I think that solar energy is great, and it's certainly something that that we've taken a lot of pride in and made a lot of progress in, as I say, in the state of Georgia, without mandates, without any mandates. This has been totally voluntary and letting the market, as Mr. Caston has indicated, letting the market do its thing and guide us where it's going to guide us. And certainly this has been beneficial to us in the state of Georgia. In fact, we've got the largest solar production factory in the country in Dalton, Georgia, and the largest solar panel production. And that's very important. But these projects are necessary and are great for a number of reasons. But I've got serious concerns about aspects of the supply chain. We talk a lot about the supply chain nowadays, and one of the things that we talk about in particular with solar panels is just we still depend on China. We still depend on China for the critical minerals that are necessary to manufacture the solar panels, even here in America. China is the OPEC of critical minerals. I've got an article here, Madam Chair, that I would like to submit for the record, ask unanimous consent. And the title of it is "Behind the Rise of U.S. Solar Power is a Mountain of Chinese Coal." And I would ask for unanimous consent to enter this into the record.
All right, without objection.
Ms. Hopper, would it be fair to say that the biggest reason solar has become so affordable is because China's cheap energy is fueled by coal?
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
What is it fueled by then? How are they making these solar panels over there? What are the energy? What energy are they? How are they getting this energy?
There's a number of different parts of China, and depending on where you are in China, some of it is coal, some of it is farmed by hydro. The part of your statement, though, that I don't agree with is that that's the main reason for the price decline. I think the main reason for price decline is really U.S. innovation, American innovation. I mean, I know your company, I know Hanwha, I know Dalton, Georgia, and they're innovators, right? They're thinking about ways to drive down costs, to make things more efficient. I think that's the main reason solar prices have declined.
Well, tell me if you're familiar with the company that I'm speaking of in Dalton, and then you recognize that they are dependent on critical minerals from China. How do we address that here in America?
Yeah, no, it's a really important question. I think it goes to the sort of purpose of this hearing. If we can bring back some of those manufacturing elements. So if you think about what goes into a solar panel, right? The first raw material is quartz, right? That is a really abundant resource we have here in the United States. Once you use the quartz to create the silicon, to create the polysilicon, we have mothballed polysilicon facilities here in the United States. Long story, which I'm happy to chat about what happened. If we can create the policies here in the United States so we can sell the polysilicon here in the United States, we don't have to rely on China for any of this. And so I think the kind of policies we're talking about will go to your concern and help. And we don't have to worry about China. We can do it here in the US.
But let me ask you this, if as my colleagues across the aisle are suggesting that we can be energy independent by depending on solar and wind energy alone, are we truly independent if we depend on China for all of our critical minerals that are necessary to build this capacity?
Well, I think that's sort of the point, is that we need to bring those opportunities back to the United States, that we need to be energy independent, and that by good policy.
But how can we be energy independent if we're not going to utilize fossil fuels in order to get us to that point where we can be energy independent?
So I represent the solar industry. I don't take a position on whether or not we go what we do with the other fossil fuels. I am very supportive of the solar industry. So I will let others on this call who are doing policy decide how much oil and gas we should ultimately have.
Last question, if I may. What is your group doing to move the solar supply chain out of China? Is your group doing anything?
Absolutely. And I know we're out of time, but I think this is so critically important. I'm glad you raised it. Thank you, Madam Chair. We have done a lot to be really clear with our companies that sort of number one priority is that the solar supply chain needs to be ethical, and there needs to be no forced labor, no child labor, nothing in our supply chain. And so we have created a traceability protocol with some third-party auditors to ensure so that manufacturers of product can have a third-party independent audit to ensure that there's no forced labor, that their supply chains are ethical. We've been working with the U.S. government to make sure that is being enforced.
But if you're operating and getting your product out of a country that is obviously using this, aren't you complicit in it by supporting the Chinese Communist Party?
I don't think so. I think that we have a pretty robust and way to ensure. Sorry, the sun is right in my eyes. To ensure that there's no forced labor in our supply chain.
But
Right,
you
thank
agree
you.
that there is forced labor.
All right,
in
the time
China
is,
when the
I
supply
let
chain
you
is-
have a little latitude there, but your time has expired, and I'll turn to and recognize myself for 5 minutes. This is what it's all about. This is what we're trying to do through the bipartisan infrastructure law, through America Competes, that is being debated on the floor of the House today, to bolster our domestic supply chains, whether we're talking about chips that are needed in everything that we do these days, or solar panel manufacturing, or electric vehicles. This is a global competitive race, and we want to make sure we are setting the policies to make things in America again and to strengthen the supply chains. And this global pandemic has really shined a light on the weaknesses there. And it should be something that we can work on in a bipartisan way. But I'm very excited about the opportunities in clean energy and energy efficiency to help lower the cost for consumers and businesses, but doing so in a way that we're growing good paying jobs all across the country. Mr. Browning, can you please tell us more about the key considerations for incentives for green hydrogen? What makes an incentive useful to companies like yours, and talk about the interplay of the infrastructure law and the incentives in out of the Build Back Better and even American Competes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to start out by saying, the biggest incentive that we have right now for green hydrogen is the market. We are seeing global demand for green products like green steel that we talked about earlier, green aluminum, green automobiles. So there is a market demand for products that are made with green energy. But in terms of government incentives, as I said earlier, that we have a proven recipe for this. It worked on wind, it worked on solar, it's worked on lithium-ion batteries, and that is the government to support research and development, and then the government to support a massive growth of the industry that allows us to automate and do all those sorts of things. And that's where the production tax credit and investment tax credit for hydrogen come in.
Thank you. Ms. Ektish, do you see potential for job creation when we're talking about green hydrogen, especially in communities that need economic investment, or they're fossil fuel tied communities and maybe they're looking at changes in the coming years?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think we talk a lot about how sometimes there's a mismatch between jobs impacted by clean energy and the job opportunities by clean energy created by clean energy. And this is one of those examples where that's not the case. And I think we're really excited about green hydrogen for a number of different reasons, but this sort of skill matching with the existing workforce in the energy sector is one really exciting reason. And we think it really offers an opportunity to put people to work using the skills and the careers they have today. And that's true for a lot of areas of the economy, but particularly for the industrial sector, where green hydrogen could be a really impactful opportunity to address high heat industrial processes in particular, and could play a really important role both as a potential low carbon feedstock or a fuel in these industrial processes. So really to create an opportunity for industrial sector to be part of this clean economy. Though there's still, of course, a lot of work to do to refine this policy around how green hydrogen is produced, where it's used, make sure that we're making progress in reducing emissions, but wholeheartedly agree that the workforce opportunity is there and significant.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about the average American, they don't understand the opportunities in green hydrogen, but they certainly understand the opportunities for electric vehicles to save money, to drive cars and trucks that are fun, to clean up the air, to address the climate crisis. And there have been some, the American auto manufacturers are really trying to win this race compared to our competitors from other countries. What has excited you recently on the announcements for factories here in America, and then what are some of the challenges you want to highlight for us?
Sure, thank you. And you mentioned some of them earlier in your opening remarks, the recent announcements from Ford and GM announcing and even opening new facilities to transition and in some cases actually reopen shuttered facilities to transition from internal combustion to electric vehicle component manufacturing. So we're very excited about those. There's a number of existing facilities in your state and around the country that are already part of this supply chain, but a tremendous opportunity to grow this supply chain if we put the right policies in place. But I think there's really a risk here. We are really on the precipice of whether this opportunity is going to be realized. A recent report from the Economic Policy Institute found about 200,000 jobs really on the bubble and really at risk if we don't make the right investments. So I think we're really excited, but I see the time has expired. So would be happy to talk more about how we can make sure that we gain those.
So get the tax
200,000
credits we
jobs.
passed here in the House through the Senate and to the president's desk.
Absolutely, as well as all of the manufacturing investments that go along with that demand incentive.
Great. Thank you very much. Next, Ms. Miller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. The topic of this hearing today is vitally important for the future of energy production in the United States. While I appreciate my colleagues across the aisle taking a serious look at how we produce clean energy and other products here in America, I fear their efforts may be focused more on hypotheticals than what is actually possible. I'd like to echo what Mr. McConnell stated in his testimony. We must utilize all energy fuels and technologies that are at our disposal. And all of the above energy strategy is essential to providing our citizens with affordable power that they need, keeping energy producing communities whole, and tackling the real challenge, which is lowering emissions instead of demonizing our energy producers. Unfortunately, President Biden's administration, his allies in Congress, and radical activists have attempted to cut traditional energy companies off from essential financing, making the transition to cleaner fuels all but impossible, dooming miners and gas and oil workers to a life of poverty and Americans to a future of darkness and unaffordable electric bills. If we are serious about providing this clean energy future for our children and our grandchildren, we cannot have activists like President Biden's jet-setting climate envoy, John Kerry, telling the coal miners of West Virginia to go make solar panels if the government were to shut down their mines. Vilifying our energy communities instead of working to find common sense solutions, such as carbon capture, will only do more to divide our country and put our futures more at risk. Mr. McConnell, given the need for an all of the above energy strategy, carbon capture is one technology that will be essential to save our traditional energy communities. In your opinion, what are the largest regulatory hurdles that Congress must undertake in order for the transition to carbon capture to take place?
Well, there's several of them. First and foremost, the 45Q legislation that's currently being considered and the increases that have been discussed and largely agreed across the board. This is an industry that requires the same type of support that wind and solar received in the early stages of its infancy and frankly still continue to receive.
Yes.
But it's fundamentally important, and it's not just because the industry believes that it's the right thing to do. But if you look at the International Energy Agency globally suggests that without carbon capture, we have no choice and no chance to achieve climate targets, none. And so the ability to decarbonize the existing fuel systems around the world, which are well over 80% of fossil fuel, we're talking about the next 20 to 40 years of real impact. And we cannot expect electric vehicles and windmills and solar panels to create that delta and impact on the climate. They are good to do. We should continue to do them, but it's not the only solution. It's not the silver bullet. Carbon capture utilization is essential, and it has to be done. The second thing I think is not only just the financial incentives, but it's regulatory. It's regulatory and policy that's going to allow de-risking of the technology. So if you look at carbon capture as something for the good of the public, which it is, it's an emissions reduction technology that frankly is unparalleled in anything that we've talked about in the entirety of this hearing today. It itself will have that kind of impact, but it needs the regulatory and policy support to be able to complete the pipelines, the necessary injection systems, all of the things that industry is coming together to do.
Thank you. I have one other question. What role does blue hydrogen have to play in this transition of carbon capture?
Well, blue hydrogen is an essential fuel. It's been stated several times today, and I couldn't agree more. But let's think for a second. A green hydrogen electrolyzer represents about 1/50th of the capacity of one single refinery need for hydrogen. So we're talking about a nascent technology that's going to be important over time, but it's going to require a lot of desalinated water, a lot of electricity that we don't have today, and all of these things that will in the future, over the next 20 to 40 years, certainly evolve. But if we want to make an impact today, we have to take the hydrogen that we're producing with natural gas, which we have in abundance, and it is inexpensive, and decarbonize it through CCUS and create the volumes of hydrogen that are going to make this hydrogen economy go. But it's not at the expense of green hydrogen. It's because it's going to be also necessary in spades.
But not blue hydrogen.
Blue hydrogen is fundamentally decarbonized hydrogen. And so whether it's blue or green or purple or orange,
No.
as long as it doesn't have the CO2, that's the key. And that's the importance of combining those technologies.
Thank you so much. I yield back my time.
Next up, Rep. Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Fantastic.
And
Thank you,
excuse me,
Madam
we
Chair.
are expecting another Democrat. They just didn't arrive. Sorry, go ahead.
Hey, I'm sorry, I missed that. Could you say that again?
We are expecting another Democrat for questioning, but they have not arrived yet. So but
Okay.
if they don't arrive after you're done, we'll go ahead and close. it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Hey, I want to thank again the witnesses, and I've enjoyed listening to this dialogue, but I got to admit, I'm a little confused sometimes as well. Ms. Eck, just want to ask you a quick question. Do you support the Twin Metals mine?
We don't take positions on specific projects as an organization.
That's courageous. Okay, so let's go back through what we've heard today. We've heard Mr. Kasten talk about how market forces have to drive what's going on. Yet, as noted earlier, we have the solar industry represented here today, and Ms. Hopper, appreciate you being here. Great to see you again. Who has received all sorts of subsidies dating back to, I believe, some of it dating back. I want to read a quote. In 1983, the American Wind Industry Association claimed that solar and wind would be, quote, competitive and self-supporting on a national level by the end of the decade if assisted by tax credits and augmented by federally sponsored R&D. Yet, here we are with and I'll quote Senator Joe Manchin, now dead, Build Back Better, that tries to add over $100 billion in subsidies back to some of those very industries, the solar, the wind, and EV credits. And according to Stephen Moore, if all tax credits are included, that number could reach $500 billion. And quote, no other industry in American history has ever received this lucrative a paycheck. We keep talking about market forces, yet all we're doing is trying to distort or manipulate them. And we're trying to do it in a way that clearly is not meeting the own targets of the industry themselves. It really is, I'll use the word again, just confounding to sit here and listen to what's going on right now. I heard Mr. Kasten say earlier that, what did he say? The public doesn't want fossil fuels. The public doesn't want solar. I don't even know where it was going. The Biden administration released a report saying we're going to have a 31 to 58% increase in natural gas demand over the next, between now and 2050, a 31 to 58% increase. Apparently the public does want it, according to the Biden administration. This is global demand. Do you really think that you're going to be able to go to some third world country and say, hey, we want you to pay New England or California rates for electricity and it's going to be awesome? No, there's not a chance in the world that it's happening. And so I want to turn to Mr. McConnell for a minute. Mr. McConnell, when you look at technologies like, as you noted, net power, using natural gas fired electricity to produce electricity, market rates, net zero emissions, Do you believe it's in America's best interest, or better yet, actually in the environment's best interest, for us to be dissuading, setting aside, preventing that type of innovation from moving forward to achieve our environmental and economic goals?
Well, Congressman, frankly, when you say our environmental goals, we're talking about the globe. It's a global issue, and we all recognize that. And sometimes here in America, we get
I kind of feel like I'm
around
part of that
our own axle, right? We're less than 10% of the emissions globally. And so if we don't have the development of globally transferable technologies that are going to be accretive to the industries and the people around the world that today use well over 80% of their fuel being coal and gas, we have to demonstrate not only the leadership and the capability, but it's a manufacturing opportunity for us to export technology, to export value to world countries, and to grow our own economy by using that global strategy to do that. It's not just about solving our own backyard, but it's the global issue. But we have an opportunity in the United States to create global capabilities and value that we can export and get value from.
And maintaining our energy security, energy independence, and the economy that we're exporting today. Mr. Browning, I'm curious from your perspective, looking at what's been happening and even some of the debate today. My 2 cents is that we truly, Mr. McConnell said this, we're part of the globe. We are, all of us are. And if we're truly looking holistically at the future of the environment, and do you believe that some of these policies that are raising prices, raising emissions, really move in the right direction?
Well, thanks for the question. Keep in mind, our country has an incredible resource in renewable power. Some of the best wind power in the world is in the mid-continent of the United States. Some of the best solar power in the world is in the southwest of the United States. We can be a renewable power superpower. We can meet all of our own energy needs with renewable power, and we can export our own renewable power in the form of green hydrogen to other parts of the world. And so, I think that for the same reasons that we talk about, our existing fossil fuel industry and sort of some of the resources we have there, we have to recognize, do we want to be the beneficiaries of the change that's going to happen in the future in the energy transition, or do we want to be the victims of that change? If the growth going forward is going to be in energy transition technologies, don't we want to at least have a position there as at least a hedge for the future? There's countries like Saudi Arabia, which are today's largest oil producer. They have the largest green hydrogen project in the world. Saudi Arabia is getting ready for an energy transition. And again, if they're wrong, they still have their existing industry. But if they're right, they're positioned to be a leader in the future. And our country has always been an energy leader. So, why not position ourselves to be a leader in energy transition technologies? It just makes common sense.
Madam Chair, thank you for the extra time. I just want to make note. Look, I agree with Mr. Browning, but it's about aligning incentives in a way that gets this to market sustainability. And clearly, the path forward so far hasn't achieved that. Yield back.
Madam Chair, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And I'll note that, and we'll put these in the record at the end, but when we're talking about fossil fuel subsidies, I don't think anyone can argue with a straight face that renewables have nowhere near the amount of subsidy that fossil fuel industry has enjoyed over time. CRS estimates $4 billion at a minimum annually. Oil Change International says could be up to 15 billion. Of course, there's the intangible drilling cost, tax credit. And then when you look at the other side of the ledger, 2019 report from the IMF found that not only was the United States #2 subsidizer of fossil fuels globally. But when they looked at explicit tax subsidies, as well as the ways Americans pay for the environmental and social health costs of fossil fuels, they calculated a whopping total of $650 billion. And that was just in 2015. So there's not a level playing field. I think that's clear. Next, we'll go to Representative Palmer. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. McConnell, do you have any idea how much land space would be required to go to 100% renewables if it's predominantly wind and solar?
Yeah, we've had some conversations here today. I don't have an exact number for you, but somewhere in the neighborhood of the entirety of the state of South Dakota has been identified. But I'd like to make a point on that question. We talk about installed capacity of electricity, and we talk about installed renewables and installed wind and solar, but that's not delivered electricity. That's electricity that's available some 20 to 25% of the time. And so when you start talking about installed capacity as the answer to our energy needs, it's not. And the storage we have in this country is less than 5%.
Now, let me ask you this. What is the single biggest threat to our electric grid? I'll leave that for anybody. Mr. Browning, you know what that is?
Well, it depends on where you are in the country, but if you're in Texas or you're in California right now, one of your concerns is you've got a lot of renewable power on your grid. And when you have an extreme weather event, you need to be able to store that renewable power to make it available for that,
well, actually,
that later time.
The North American Electric Reliability Commission put out a report, and they said the number one threat to our electric power grid reliability is changing the fuel mix. And that's what concerns me. We got a lot of people, that claim to know the science and don't have any engineering background, but that seem to think that we can just turn this thing into a completely renewable power grid overnight, and that's simply not possible. I'm for renewables, but if you want to talk about clean energy with no emissions, why aren't we talking about next gen nuclear? I mean, does it make sense when the life expectancy, generation life expectancy for a next gen power facility is 100 years versus maximum maybe 25 years for solar, maybe 25 to 30 for wind? Does that make sense to you, Mr. McConnell?
It doesn't, and whether it's nuclear or whether it's decarbonized fuel secure energy, whether that's coal or gas, the whole idea is how can we deliver baseload electricity with zero carbon emissions? That's the question, not whether or not it's wind or solar or fossil,
And we're not going to stop it completely with advances in technology, but there's also a cost that a lot of my colleagues don't want to talk about. And Europe's experiencing this right now in terms of excess winter deaths. In China, a lot of my colleagues are big supporters of China. That's what this bill is really about. They're really supporting China and their renewable effort. But what they don't want to admit is what's going on with forced labor in China, the genocide, where a lot of these components are made. But also, they may not be aware of this, that in China's push to look greener, they literally are letting people freeze because they don't have access to power. And we're seeing this in Europe with excess winter deaths in the UK and Europe. That's what concerns me, having worked for a couple of international engineering companies, including one that was in the environmental systems area. There's a cost in terms of lives lost, in terms of health consequences for people. Should my Democrat colleagues just consider this collateral damage? Mr. McConnell?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't go that route at all. In fact, we have the capabilities for it not to be. And I think that's the whole key. We can't just make unilateral decisions that we want to be something over the next 5 to 10 years. We have to make an energy transition occur. We have to have suitable baseload energy, fuel, secure supplies of electricity. And we need to build in the renewable programs that we're talking about. But this idea that we're just going to slam it all over to one end right away at the expense of reliability and cost is really a fool's errand. And that's not what people are looking for. And it's clear we had that issue in Texas, and we suffered through it in a big way.
Well, I'll yield back. My time's expired. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Well, thank you very much. And frankly, Mr. Palmer, I was surprised that you went down that road, because it's just impossible to ignore the climate fueled deaths in our own country over the past year, due to the heat wave out west, due to a bizarre cold snap in Texas.
Madam Chairman, the reports, the science on this is there's 17 to 20 times more people die from coal related issues.
I don't think you want to go down that road, Mr. Palmer. So let's move on. I'll recognize Mr. McEachin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your leadership in convening this hearing today. You know, confronting the climate crisis poses unique challenges and opportunities. We are facing the much necessary prospect of transforming the way we generate and use energy, and in doing so, have a chance to do so using made in America materials and American labor. We also have the opportunity and the responsibility to uplift and include in this transformation environmental justice communities that have historically been left out of this conversation. We must take action to get to net zero global economy by 2050, and we must ensure that we have the manufacturing and industrial capacity to do so. The Biden administration has taken steps to ensure the federal government procurement process is done in a sustainable fashion, including achieving 100% carbon-free electricity by 2030 and net zero emissions from federal procurement by 2050. The federal government can and should leverage its buying power to do more to move us towards our climate goals. But obviously we still need to do more. My first question is for Ms. Jessica Ekdish. I hope I didn't hurt your last name too badly. Virginia has taken a lead in the offshore wind and energy space, with Simmons Renewable Energy committing $200 million to build the first U.S. offshore wind turbine blade manufacturing facility. Obviously, I'm proud to see Virginia leading in this space, but you know in your testimony that the industrial sector represents a significant source of U.S. emissions, accounting for 29% of greenhouse gas emissions in 2019, when accounting for electricity use, with emissions from the industrial sector expected to increase through mid-century, negating the emissions reductions we may see in the power and transportation sectors. If we are to take climate threat seriously, we must work to reduce emissions across all sectors, including the industrial sector. What policies can we put in place to bend this curve of projected emissions increase? What do we risk if we do not make the necessary policy changes to do so?
Thank you so much for the question. And you did not butcher my name at all, so good job. But I think this is a really important question. The job creation in the manufacturing sector has to go hand in hand with emissions reduction, not only for climate purposes, for the health of our communities, but this is also about competitiveness. Just as other countries are rushing to capture these clean energy technology jobs, they're also investing significantly in emissions reductions in these sectors. So we're really falling behind on both fronts. And as the global economy becomes increasingly carbon constrained, we need to position our manufacturers to compete globally. You mentioned already procurement as one key avenue to do that. As part of that, the Biden administration initiative that you mentioned, there's a first time Buy Clean program that's being stood up as well to really use the purchasing power of the federal government to support and drive innovation and support clean domestic manufacturers and domestic manufacturers that are making those investments. But we also need to really support our industrial partners in making those investments. The Build Back Better Act has a critical $4 billion investment to DOE that would aid companies in carrying out major carbon emissions and pollution reducing upgrades at their facilities. There's a number of important provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that would help along those lines as well. So I think procurement, direct investment are key ways to make sure that our manufacturers are competitive in this, again, increasingly carbon constrained global economy.
Thank you for that. Madam Chair, I am going to give you 55 seconds back. I yield back.
Great. Thank you, Rep. McEachin. And thank you to all of our witnesses today for this very interesting and enlightening discussion. Rep. Graves, do you have a unanimous consent request?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, asking consent that a release by Jobs for Minnesotans, January 26th release be included in the record, and an E&E News article dated January 28th, Clean Energy Surge won't meet net zero goals. Asking consent be included in the record.
All right, without objection. And without objection, I'll enter into the record a February 2022 letter from the Solar Energy Manufacturing for America Coalition that reviews domestic solar manufacturing challenges and opportunities and provides evidence for how a solar manufacturing tax credit, like the one we passed in the Build Back Better Act, would be beneficial for the economy and for American workers. Without objection, all members have 10 business days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses. I ask the witnesses to respond as promptly as you are able. And I want to thank everyone again for joining us for our first hearing of 2022. Our next one later this month will examine actions taken and additional needs to improve grid resilience across the country. Thank you all very much. We are adjourned.